Well, there's a growing momentum to the conflict in Libya. For the first time in weeks, rebels have made a concerted attempt to break through government lines around the enclave of Misrata, surging south, east and west from the port and sustaining pretty heavy casualties in the process. Meanwhile, in Brussels, NATO members have been meeting to plan a post-Gaddafi future, rather confidently asserting that it's only a question of time before the Libyan dictator goes. For the latest on the fighting, here's our reporter David Loyne, who is in Misrata.
From early morning, heavy explosions could be heard to the east of Misrata as Colonel Gaddafi's forces responded with Grad rockets to a rebel offensive. For more than 3 weeks, Misrata's rebel army had remained at the fixed positions they'd taken up after they forced Libyan government troops out of the city. But on Tuesday, they made a series of probing raids to the west, and now their first sustained assault to the east. Rebel fighters I spoke to said they'd moved several miles forward of their eastern front line to the outskirts of the next coastal town, Tawaga. Field ambulances took a steady stream of casualties for treatment.
The field hospital is receiving casualties every day, and the number of casualties is between 10 to 80. We received 6 injuries yesterday, 4 of them were wounded, while 2 were killed. This morning, we received 4 wounded rebel soldiers.
The main commander on the southern front, Salahuddin Badi, was one of those wounded, but was seen making an inspirational speech to his men with blood streaming down his face before going off for medical treatment. NATO forces were alerted on Tuesday to a move forward by Gaddafi's troops, but distinguishing between the two sides would have been difficult from the air in this fast-moving situation.
Well, that report from David Loyne, who joins me now on the line from Misrata. David, are you in any position to say who's got the upper hand in this battle of Misrata at the moment?
Well, I think certainly if it were motivation and inspiration, it's very much the rebels. They're showing now more tactical competence than they did in early days. Both in the western front line earlier on this week, they're making more competent raids down into the areas around Zliten. And in the east, I mean, one of the striking things about the eastern front line, it hasn't moved for several weeks, but people I spoke to down there earlier today said that the Gaddafi forces that they'd encountered appeared to be trying to give themselves up. All were saying, some of the prisoners they'd taken were saying that they were forced to fight. Now, of course, people would say that once they're taken, but there do seem to be some signs of very low morale on the Gaddafi side and very high morale and increasing technical competence on the rebel side. Of course, Gaddafi still has the Grad rocket launchers, which are the weapons which cause most of the injuries and very significant number of deaths, more than a dozen today.
David Loyne in Misrata, thank you very much. Well, 3 months into the Libyan operation, supporting what has become an anti-Gaddafi uprising, defence ministers of NATO's 26 nations have committed to extending the operation for another 90 days. NATO's Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said leaders must now look beyond the conflict.
We agreed that the time has come to plan for the day after the conflict. Gaddafi's history, it is no longer a question of if he goes, but when he goes. It may take weeks, but it could happen tomorrow. And when he goes, the international community has to be ready.
Secretary-General of NATO speaking earlier in Brussels. Well, joining me now from New York is Richard Haass, who's President of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also former Director of Policy Planning for the US State Department and involved in post-war planning for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Richard Haass, thank you for joining us. Now, NATO agreed today that they would not take a lead role in Libya's reconstruction. Do you agree that that's the right way forward?
The short answer is no. It's awfully late in the day to be talking about getting into the planning for the aftermath. And second of all, if NATO is not going to take a lead role, it obviously begs the question, who is? The even more fundamental question is exactly what is the role going to be?
So you think that NATO should be taking the lead role?
Somebody should. I mean, again, when you begin these things, one of the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan is that what comes after is often the most difficult part. So everybody, for obvious reasons, is focusing now on getting rid of Gaddafi, on the humanitarian operation. But the really difficult stuff will start if and when he's gone. And the idea then is you've got to try to build a nation, so to speak, in a place where there's virtually no national institution. There's an enormous task in providing security, as well as the basics or essentials of virtually every aspect of political, social, and economic life. The only good news is you've got a large bank account filled with proceeds from Libyan oil sales. But I wouldn't underestimate for a minute the dimensions of the task.
Do you think the Europeans should be taking, or the EU, a lead role in this? After all, I mean, Europe has the most to gain and lose if Libya goes belly up.
Absolutely, and I would think that the Europeans are going to have to, because the President of the United States, on several occasions, at the same time he said that Gaddafi must go, has also said there cannot be or will not be American boots on the ground. So there will not be any U.S. role in providing security on the ground. And we all know that in the absence of security, you can't have the development of anything that looks like normal political or economic life. So I believe you are going to need a sizable external force, and then you are going to need all sorts of assistance in essentially building a modern country from the ground up. And I think it does have to come mostly from Europe. The Arabs are preoccupied with what's going on in the Arab world. Again, the United States is not going to play a large role. As best I can tell, that leaves Europe.
Now, I know it's difficult to generalise about these things, but having been involved in the post-war planning for Iraq and Afghanistan, what would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned for the immediate aftermath, for the few weeks after Gaddafi goes, if he goes?
Don't underestimate it by any means. Maintain order. Certainly in Iraq, one of the biggest failures was to allow all the looting to take place. Don't assume that people who agreed on getting rid of the regime are going to agree on anything else. Indeed, there probably will be fallings out. Don't rule out political participation from people who supported Gaddafi. Yes, certain individuals might be ruled out, but by and large, they may also represent the greatest talent that exists in the country. So there are some very specific lessons from not just those two cases, but any number of aftermaths, and they all ought to be applied. And again, people ought to be working now, 24/7, as we would say, to get ready for this, because it could happen shortly. And the early days of an aftermath are often set the character or the personality of all that comes afterwards.
Richard Haass, thank you very much. Well, let's take a look now at some of the day's other news.